Well, hello and good afternoon, and welcome to those of you who are joining us on Zoom. My name is Andrew O'Shaughnessy. I'm the Saunders Director of the Robert H. Smith International Center for Jefferson Studies here at Monticello. This is a 78-acre campus where each year we host up to 30 fellows, and it's my pleasure to be welcoming one of them, Johanna Heide, and she is going to be speaking on Sally Hemings' forced itinerancy as a site of possibility. She is a PhD fellow at the University of Potsdam in Germany, which incidentally is in one of the former palaces of Frederick the Great. It's got to be one of the most lovely campuses. She's studying literary and cultural studies, but in an interdisciplinary program with a minor in cosmopolitanisms. So please join me in welcoming Johanna Heide. Thank you.
Thank you for this wonderful introduction, and it is indeed a lovely campus. And I would like to also thank the whole ICGS team for inviting me to Monticello. I had originally planned to be here already in 2020, but then the pandemic hit, as you all know, and everything was kind of on hold. So 2 years later, I'm really happy to finally be here. And yeah, it's been a wonderful couple of weeks. I've enjoyed sitting in an actual library again, going through an actual archive, and most of all the conversations with the other fellows, and also here at the library. And I want to give a special thanks to Andrina Tay, Andrew Davenport, and Suzanne Holt, who've all been of great help. And yeah, I'll go ahead and share my screen now.
Right, excellent.
So I'll start the slideshow. I hope you can all see it by now. The title is Sally Hemings' Forced Itinerancy as a Site of Possibility. And it is really a work in progress of what will hopefully eventually become a chapter of my PhD project, in which I very broadly look at enslaved women's practices of movement and resistance, and how their visions and hopes remain alive across time. And this larger project is an interdisciplinary endeavor that combines the fields of literary and culture studies, but also Black studies and history. And before I speak more about Sally Hemings, I kind of have to introduce you to the central term and framework that I use, and that also features in today's presentation title, which is itinerancy. And to give you an idea of what this is all about, I will read from an excerpt in which I introduce the term via the Black feminist poet Cheryl Clark and via Harriet Tubman, who she considers to be a quintessential itinerant. So please bear with me, even though this is not yet directly connected to Monticello and Sally Hemings. According to poet and Combahee River collective member Cheryl Clark, itinerancy is a cardinal characteristic of Black feminists. A characteristic that connects Black women of the past and present, women like Tubman and Clark herself, in movement. Even though Clark does not develop the idea of itinerancy much further than that, the term stuck with me when I began working on the theme of Black women's resistance and mobility back in 2019. What I found intriguing was that both the original usage of the term that refers to traveling preachers following their religious calling, as well as Clark's Black feminist framing, emphasize a form of movement that is about much more than just physical movement. Rather, itinerancy describes a way of being in the world, a way of life. And just like that, Clark provided me with an umbrella term that describes what my PhD project is interested in. Practices and ways of being enacted by Black women vis-a-vis past, but also present lives on the line, and vis-a-vis uninhabitable worlds that do not allow for settling. Put differently, and this is in fact the working title of my PhD project, I'm interested in Black women's attempts at making a way out of no way. And I should add that I put itinerancy into dialogue with similar terms and theories of movement, such as Neil Roberts' freedom as marronage and Saidiya Hartman's waywardness. A brief look onto Harriet Tubman's life explains why Clarke invokes her as a prime example of an itinerant and begins to illustrate the multifaceted realms and ways in which itinerancy can unfold. As a Black woman born enslaved in the 19th century, Tubman lived in one of the most horrific periods in American history, a period that reduced Black people to chattel status and thought to bind them in all realms thinkable, making the forms of movement mentioned in the quote, emotional, physical, intellectual, and political movement or agency as others would perhaps put it, virtually impossible. Nevertheless, enslaved men and women resisted in myriad ways. Amongst others, they practiced what Saidiya Hartman, a thinker who features quite prominently in my work, terms itinerant acts of defiance. Tubman is of course best known for defying enslavement through escape and for helping numerous others to do so as well via the Underground Railroad. On her rescue missions, Tubman traveled back and forth between North and South, between enslavement and relative freedom, between Black and white spaces. Repeated acts of fugitive movement and physical withdrawal thus seem to be key to Tubman's itinerancy. Yet, what is less often remembered is that she not only practiced itinerant defiance by means of spectacular escapes, she also strained against oppression and enclosure in her day-to-day life and from childhood to old age. As a child, Tubman, for example, made first attempts at carving out space for herself by stealing away temporarily and by familiarizing herself with the outdoors. Next to laying the foundation for her later rescue missions, in which the outdoors literally allowed Tubman to find a way out of no way, this early movement away from enslavement, and at least temporarily out of reach for her enslavers, was already more than just physical movement. It challenged the social order of the time. As Hartman writes, stealing away was the vehicle for the redemptive figuration of dispossessed individual and community, reconstituting kin relations, contravening the object status of chattel, transforming pleasure, and investing in the body as a site of sensual activity, sociality, and possibility, and last, redressing the pained body. Tubman's act of stealing away as a child thus already foreshadows some of the aspects that motivate her later actions as a conductor for the Underground Railroad, as speaker and activist both for abolition and women's rights, as founder of a mutual aid association, as spy, military mastermind, and nurse for the Union Army during the Civil War, and last but not least, as caretaker of family and friends. The enumeration that is far from complete illustrates that Tubman's life was indeed characterized by constant emotional, physical, intellectual, and political labor, as well as itinerant movement that shapeshifts and ranges from fugitive and clandestine modes to very public expressions. Tubman's last words before her death, "I go to prepare a place for you," are perhaps what describes her life itinerant mission best. She went literal and metaphorical places few have gone before in order to liberate Black women and men. For her, this mission and vision did not stop with death. And even though Tubman, of course, could not anticipate the role she would come to play in the Black feminist struggles to come, her utterance can also be read as a foreshadowing for the connections she would prepare for future generations who continued the struggle for a liberated future through their own itinerant acts of defiance. Many of them, including Clarke and her fellow organizers at the Combahee River Collective, see themselves on a historical continuum because centuries later, racism and sexism still put Black women's lives on the line. Like their enslaved ancestors, Black feminists in the present, however, don't settle for such a precarious position, but actively strain against oppression and enclosure in various modes, including artistic and creative ones that are inspired by and tap into past practices of itinerant defiance and the yet to be realized visions of liberation that animate them. Taking Clarke's quote and her notion of itinerancy developed via Tubman as a prompt, my project turns to some of these contemporary cultural texts. So far, a podcast episode, reenactment, satire, as well as literature. in order to think with and through the forceful connections they forged to historical subjects that, like Tubman, can be deemed itinerant. The historical subjects that I consider as of now are Sally Hemings, Caroline Branham, and Ona Judge, and I might add a chapter on Ellen Craft. These women, as well as their modes of itinerancy, are varied and complex. Some are well known, and their practices and ways of being are easily recognizable as resistant. Others are largely forgotten or not traditionally considered resistant. When I presented an outline of my PhD project that did not yet include Sally Hemings at a conference in Potsdam back in 2019, the former director of the Getting Word project, Naya Bates, and poet Shayla Sabri, who, by the way, has written a wonderful poetry collection about Sally Hemings, they were both in the audience. And when they suggested that I might also want to consider Sally Hemings as part of my project, I was puzzled at first. What I knew about Sally Hemings didn't match what I was looking at. Women who resisted enslavement by moving away from it, and some by opposing it publicly. Women, to invoke Saidiya Hartman again, whose itinerant acts of defiance hinged on contestation or even open rebellion against the status quo. But after some time and on reading and learning more about Sally Hemings, I eventually understood why her story would be a crucial addition to my project and why I needed to broaden the scope of which forms of movement I considered. The following quote by Diane Swanwright that I came across during one of my first days here at the library as an ICGS fellow, in fact, perfectly captures how my thinking shifted after Naya's comment at the conference. Swanwright says, "It was around Beverly Gray's kitchen table that I first heard the phrase bringing children out of Egypt. It was used in describing the deliberate behavior of enslaved women to gain freedom for their children, by having a father who could and would free them, or by having skin light enough not to appear black. Bev's comment set my thinking on enslaved women on its head. In my mind, only Harriet Tubman and Sojourner Truth had such agency. Sally Hemings, liberator, an interesting idea. If she and other enslaved women deliberately thought to bring children out, they were in some way doing what only God could do, freeing powerless people. A novel concept, to say the least. Those without power exercising it, and those with power letting it seep away through sexual acts they were privileged to have simply because they were in power." When I stood in the Sally Hemings exhibit in the second week of my fellowship and read Liberator on the sign in front of her room, I immediately had to think about that quote. And in my head, next to Liberator, I added itinerant. And once this idea had fully seeped in and I, in fact, settled on writing a chapter on Sally Hemings, I reread the few archival records that relate her story, her choices, and her movements, as well as secondary sources like Annette Gordon-Reed's work. And even though Sally Hemings' story is, of course, well known to all of you, let me briefly share a summary in which I consider her story through the lens of itinerancy. Unlike individuals like Harriet Tubman, Ona Judge, and others who turned to voluntary movement in the hope of getting away from their enslaver, Sally Hemings' articulation of itinerancy begins with a different trajectory. She does not opt for movement, but is forced to follow Thomas Jefferson's summons to Paris, in effect moving towards instead of away from him. Thomas Jefferson, minister to France at the time, had initially asked for his daughter Maria to be accompanied by some good lady on her journey passing from America to France, and specifies, quote, Isabel, for instance, if she has had the smallpox, quote, end. Isabel Hearn, who Jefferson refers to, however, had not had the smallpox and moreover got pregnant. So instead of her, the 14-year-old Sally Hemings is then forced to make the transatlantic voyage. Though not by choice, the voyage made a deep impression on Hemings, as overseer Edmund Bacon remarked in 1860, quote, Sally Hemings went to France with Maria Jefferson when she was a little girl. They crossed the ocean alone. I have often heard her tell about it, quote, end. One aim during my stay was to better understand what Sally Hemings' life looked like before and after this life-altering journey, and to understand how this journey might have impacted her sense of self and also of place. To actually see Mulberry Row and to learn more about the enslaved at Monticello on site definitely helped me understand just how different life in Paris must have been for her, where, as historians like Annette Gordon-Reed have shown, Sally Hemings not only witnessed the beginnings of the French Revolution, but also had possibilities that were far out of reach to ordinary enslaved women in Virginia. During her time in France, Sally Hemings, for example, had free time to herself, especially after Polly, which is Mariah's nickname, joins her sister Patsy in convent school. Sally Hemings then also starts to learn the language. She is able to observe Parisians, black and white, and she to some extent even participates in their social life, and most likely also even attended upper class balls to which she accompanied Jefferson's daughters. And she eventually starts to receive wages. In short, Sally Hemings navigated both black and white spaces in a foreign country, and she managed to carve out space and autonomy for herself, which connects her to other itinerants and their longing for freedom. Unlike most of them, Sally Hemings even got a chance to become a free person before the law, since France adhered to the freedom principle. A fact that Sally Hemings over the course of her stay in Paris most certainly became aware of and later used as a bargaining chip. Of course, it is also in France that Sally Hemings and Jefferson enter upon a sexual relationship, which, as Annette Gordon-Reed reminds us, is impossible to know or reconstruct exactly, but certainly further complicates Hemings' position in the tension between structures of violation and the attempt at agency. On the one hand, the relationship draws her even further into the structures of enslavement, especially when she falls pregnant. But on the other hand, and in combination with the proximity to formal freedom, it also enabled Sally Hemings, an enslaved subject, which the law posited outside of contractual relations, to make claims for herself and for her unborn child. And when Jefferson's time in Paris came to a close, she negotiated. And I'll show that famous quote from Madison Hemings' recollections. He desired to bring my mother back to Virginia with him, but she demurred. She was just beginning to understand the French language well, and in France she was free, while if she returned to Virginia, she would be re-enslaved. So she refused to return with them. To induce her to do so, he promised her extraordinary privileges and made a solemn pledge that her children should be freed at the age of 21 years. In consequence of his promises, on which she implicitly relied, she returned with him to Virginia. So vis-a-vis a free but uncertain future in a foreign country, Hemings decides to, quote, wield her sexuality as a weapon of the weak, a phrase that Harriet Jacobs introduces in Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. And Sally Hemings uses her proximity to Jefferson to her advantage. So while the return to the US instead of away from once again moves Sally Hemings closer into the structures of enslavement, this time around, Jefferson no longer fully dictated the terms of Hemings' second transatlantic voyage. Undeniably driven by a quest for more freedom in her own life in the form of extraordinary privileges, and eventually in her children's lives in the form of legal freedom, it was Sally Hemings who made the calculated decision to trust Jefferson's word and who opted for movement back to Virginia and to her family, rather than staying in France. Her attempt at making a way out of no way, thus, is also intricately tied to movement. But unlike other resistance practices, it does not entail open rebellion against Jefferson or against the status quo via physical withdrawal or public denouncement. Instead, Sally Hemings engages in a more subtle form of resistance by negotiating and by claiming a life oriented towards values that are most important to her, caring for and trying to secure a better life for her kin. A motivation that connects itinerants across the board, at least the ones that I'm considering in my work. And not all of them are, in fact, as successful in securing freedom for their kin as Sally Hemings. In order to understand the full scope of her actions, it is therefore crucial to also consider the sides of possibility she created for her children, for what moved her closer into the confines of slavery led to greater possibilities and mobility for them. I'll just very briefly mention some of the aspects this entailed. And I'll quote Madison Hemings again. He writes, "As children, we were permitted to stay about the great house and only required to do such light work as going on errands. Moreover, he and his siblings received formal training and music lessons, and eventually the older two, Beverly and Harriet, left Monticello during Jefferson's lifetime with his tacit consent, and they moved to the DC area where they passed into white society. The younger two, Madison and Aston, were freed after Thomas Jefferson's death according to his will and moved down to Charlottesville, where they lived together with their mother, who had been given her time. Both of them later left for Ohio, and Aston would eventually move further north to Wisconsin and would also pass into white society. It is impossible to say whether Sally Hemings imagined her children's freedom the way it unfolded, but what is certain is that just like Tubman did for her family, she brought them out of Egypt in her own way. And on doing so, she created a legacy that, despite the scarce archival traces left of her, still reverberate today in many different shapes and forms. And one of them is art. A quote by Annette Gordon-Reed that I came across during my time here at Monticello points to these reverberations and their potential. She writes, "In the end, it will probably be left to novelists, playwrights, and poets unencumbered by the need for footnotes to get the ultimate meaning of this story." And I'll use this quote to kind of move on to the second layer of the project, which, as I mentioned in the beginning, is not primarily a historical one, but considers how Sally Hemings and other archival subject stories speak to artists, novelists, and other cultural producers in the contemporary moment. And while the cultural texts that I consider are vastly different, I think I mentioned some of the genres in the beginning, amongst others, podcast, satire, really different forms. They all have one thing in common, and that is that they tell us as much about the present and where it might be headed as they do about the past, leading to narratives that Saidiya Hartman in Venus into Acts describes as narratives that really illustrate the intimacy of our experience with the lives of the dead, and that show that, like them, we are caught up in the incomplete project of freedom. This description definitely fits the 2021 novella My Monticello, written by Jocelyn Nicole Johnson. Johnson in this novella introduces us to a group of modern-day itinerants bravely facing sites of past, present, and future violence in and around Charlottesville. And since I feel I've already talked quite a lot, I'll let the author herself say a few more words about the novella, its main protagonists, as well as the setting. And I'll play a recording that is from a book event with the author here at Monticello that took place last October.
My Monticello is the story of a diverse group of Charlottesville neighbors in a kind of near future that could be now, almost a very familiar near future, in a time of unraveling where things have fallen apart. And this group of neighbors has, sorry, my hair is on the mic. This group of neighbors is forced to flee their homes on First Street, which is in the neighborhood where I live, when violent white supremacists attack their homes. And if you live in Charlottesville, you know what a jaunt bus is. They go on a jaunt bus. They drive the route that I drove tonight to get here, and they end up taking refuge here at Monticello, starting in this welcome pavilion where we're sitting right now, and eventually going up to the house. And they're led by an imagined descendant of Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings, who's a young woman who's a college student at UVA.
Yeah, so towards the end of the clip, Johnson mentions that the main protagonist of the novella is an imagined descendant of Sally Hemings, and her name is Denasia Hemings Love. She is the first person narrator of the novella, and she kind of chronicles the group's desperate attempt at making a way out of no way as they are faced with both white supremacist takeover of their hometown as well as climate catastrophe. And Denasia's blood relation to Sally Hemings, as well as the fact that when the walls start to close in on her, she leads the group of neighbors to Monticello, the place that Sally Hemings returned to in order to secure freedom for her children, is what drew me to the novella. And over the course of the novella, and I feel I should apologize a bit for spoilers, it becomes clear that there are many more connections between the two women. The most prominent is that they are both pregnant when faced with life-altering decisions. But there are other parallels that will become apparent when I share some quotes. And since the first quote I'd like to share is actually part of that video that I just played, I'll go ahead and play another short section.
My Monticello is the story of a diverse.
Sorry. We've already heard that, so I'll try to go to the next slide.
I did not know that I would bring us here, not even as we passed the steep drive up to the orchard, or slowed at the curve near the old-timey general store with its dark planked walls and massive wheel of the mill clinging to one side. Across a parking lot, a plantation house turned tavern shone white with black shuttered windows. I kept on, following the slender tree-lined route, rounding a set of S-curves pulled forward as if by gravitation. The jaunt, squat and heavy, skidded towards the edge of the road like we might tumble into the trees. It was only when I saw Monticello's stone-faced bridge, loosened in the twilight, that's when I understood. I did not know that I would.
Sorry about that. I'll go to the next slide so that you can read the quote that you just heard. Yeah. So what stood out to me in that passage is that Denisha describes the, at least for me now, very familiar route from Charlottesville to Monticello. And on doing so, it seems as if Monticello almost summons Denisha. And what starts as forced movement away from a site of present-day violence, the white supremacist takeover of Charlottesville, soon turns into movement towards a site that also has a complex history of violence, but also of resistance. And while Denisha has been at Monticello before, the extreme circumstances under which she now returns change her relationship to the place and its legacy. And I'll share another quote that illustrates this. And I'll go ahead and read the quote. Everything at the top of that hill felt new to me that morning, transfigured from the times I'd come before, for school trips, for work. Before, there'd always been some measure of distance, a wall between whatever Monticello was and my real life. I'd kept real life in one place and the imagined life of my ancestors in another unexamined place, like a room with no windows. Now, my real life flailed and smoked behind me. Now, this was my life. Walking up, I felt myself seesawing again between density and lightness, between Mama's disavowal of this painful heritage and Ma Violet's cautious regard. What is interesting to me in this quote is how past and present collapse into each other, and how Denisha realizes that the world her ancestors occupied has neither materially nor ideologically disappeared, but extends into her present, leaving her no choice but to finally face the room with no windows, which of course alludes to Sally Hemings' room. A confrontation that, as the last line suggests, can lead to very different outcomes across generations, ranging from disavowal to something like cautious regard, or both at the same time, as is true for Denisha. And as she grapples with her heritage, Denisha eventually arrives at the same questions to her famous ancestor that nearly everyone looking at Sally Hemings' story wonders about, and that the archive will never reveal. I'll show another quote. They had children together, he said. Do you think he cared about her? Do you think it's possible she loved him at all? I wanted him to stop talking. I wanted to walk deep out into the muddy yard. How are you supposed to love somebody, I said, who has that much power over you? I know, Knox said. The whole situation is so wrong, so outrageous. All I'm trying to say is, even in small ways, doesn't one person always have more power than another? Knox said this like he was asking me something personal, like he was asking, is it possible for you to love me? I felt so shaky then, but I kept standing. I was thinking, what did it mean if I loved Knox? Did it mean I hated something myself? Or was the dark feeling in my gut something older, something outside of me and him? This quote is taken from a conversation between Denisha and her white college boyfriend Knox, who besides an elderly couple is the only white person on the mountaintop. And what Johnson manages to do here is to craft a narrative that through revisiting a forever unanswered question of the past, really asks the reader to instead think about how similar questions and dilemmas that defy easy answers resonate today. For Denisha, this means to confront her own relationship with Knox and the question if and how it is shaped by a past in which interracial relationships have always implied about power imbalance. And even if she's still hesitant to make these connections, she kind of begins to see her own experience more through the lens of Sally Hemings' lived reality. And the last two quotes that I want to show illustrate how the narrator's engagement with the past eventually evolves and how she, vis-a-vis a truly desperate situation in the end, starts to embrace not only the community she finds herself in the present, but also her heritage and community that reaches back into the past. And I'll go ahead and read these quotes. I could hear a voice, unsteady but rising, Ma Violet's voice. She was singing an old hymn I half remembered, and Miss Edith's voice fell into. Other folks seemed to know its rhythm, the way they swayed to it. And when I walked toward that singing, the group pulled me in, one hand after another, until I was standing beside my grandma and part of the rough circle they'd made. I felt their gazes rising to take me in, like they wanted to hear my voice too, like it was an extension of theirs. Instead of wanting to walk away from the past, like she still does when Knox mentioned Sally Hemings and Thomas Jefferson in the earlier conversation, the quote that I showed before, Denisha now walks towards that old hymn that might allude to knowledge passed down the generation. And she starts to really seek community with her grandmother and the other women in the circle. And while in this quote, it is still unclear whether she will enter into what I read as the chorus of her ancestors, the next quote makes it unmistakably clear that she does. I've collected everybody's name along with the dates of our birth and Ma Violet's dying day. I'm placing these pages inside Thomas Jefferson's book, Notes on the State of Virginia. We'll watch over all that happens here forever and ever, along with all the others who've lived and dreamed and died here. Let our bodies fill the space between old and new until all of it is indistinguishable, until all that remains is one great glow of souls lighting the way back home. So ultimately, Denisha comes to see her own journey as an extension of those who've come before and who, to invoke Harriet Tubman's last words again, have gone and prepared a place of strength and resilience for her to tap into. A place and a practice that Cheryl Clark calls itinerancy, and that is perhaps more important than ever in a time that bears uncanny parallels to the novella. Historian Tia Miles, whose most recent book, All That She Carried, was on my nightstand during the fellowship, referring to what she calls our own societal demons, says, who better to show us how to act when hope for the future is under threat than an entire cast of enslaved brave women who were nothing and had nothing by the dominant standards of their time, yet managed to save whom and what they loved. What makes Monticello such a special place is, of course, that through the efforts of Lucia Stanton and Diane Swanwright, who started the Getting Word project more than 30 years ago, we actually know many of the individuals that were impacted by Sally Hemings' itinerancy and her attempt to save whom she loved. And one of my aims during the fellowship was to learn more about the Getting Word archive and to think with it, rather than just with a novella and an imagined descendant. After all, and that is also what distinguishes Sally Hemings' story from most of the other archival subjects I'm thinking with, her descendant stories are right here. So guided by Stanton's research and with the help of Suzanne Holt, I delved right into the oral histories that were literally sitting next to me in the library in order to see if I could find similar itinerant connections than the turn to fiction had revealed. And I certainly did. And though I've only seen a tiny fraction of what's in that archive, what surprised me on reading through both the interviews from the 90s as well as more recent ones in the press was to learn how closely some of the experiences which descendants described matched Johnson's portrayal in the novella. And to illustrate this, let me just share two quotes by Brenda Yorkowski. I hope I'm pronouncing this correctly, who is a Sally Hemings descendant and was interviewed by the New York Times in 2018. And I put her quotes right next to one from the novella that I read earlier. So yeah, that way I think what I'm getting at becomes quite obvious. But I'm going to read what's on the left side. And yeah, Brenda Yukursky says, I have people in my family who don't want to have anything to do with this. One of my dad's sisters did not want to talk about the Jefferson thing at all. Aunt Alice was a proud Black woman, and she felt, why would I want to embrace that legacy? He owned her. She couldn't get past that. But I look at it as Sally Hemings accomplished something amazing for her children, which was freedom. And here I'll go right ahead to the second quote. And again, I'm going to read what's on the left side. I got to participate in an archaeological dig at Monticello. We were trekking through the woods in an area that is off limits to visitors. One of the archaeologists pointed up the hill to an area where Elizabeth Hemings' house was. Standing there in the woods with two of my distant cousins, who also descended from Elizabeth Hemings, to me was an experience. We all looked at each other and thought, if she could see us here today. So what's interesting to me in Yukursky's first quote is that she mentions the really different reactions to the Hemings legacy in her own family, which matches what Johnson says about Denicia's family in the novella, and which in fact matches also a lot of the other family interviews from the 90s that I read. In the second quote, Yukursky shares how inhabiting the same space as one of her ancestors led to a feeling of greater connection for her. And that is, of course, something that also came up in the novella. And let me just add here that this particular quote was really interesting to me because the site that is mentioned, according to Derek Wheeler, is actually really close to Tufton House, where I'm currently staying. And it made me think about the talk that Melissa gave last week and the idea of presences that she mentioned, and also that how we are positioned vis-a-vis the archive definitely changes our relationship to these presents. I later learned that Johnson, in the process of writing the novella, had in fact reached out to the descendants community, and that she really wanted to do their stories justice, as Andrew Davenport, who you've, by the way, seen in the video as a moderator. And he's currently the director of the Getting Word project. And yeah, he shared a little bit that Johnson had reached out and that her intention was really to do justice to the stories. And so these parallels kind of started to make sense. But even before that conversation, and I think actually as soon as I got here, I was already convinced that my chapter on Sally Hemings, in addition to the novella, must not only include, but in fact start with descendants' own voices. And when I moreover learned through Stanton's research that it was primarily the female descendants who never forgot Sally Hemings, tapped into her story and described her, amongst others, as bright, intelligent, very special, and extraordinary, even though that was still a time when there was really a hostile environment of disbelief. It became clear to me that the very act of passing the story on is in itself a powerful mode of Black feminist itinerancy. And so where I am today, with Sally Hemings' female descendants' voices carrying forward her legacy, is where I now begin my chapter. And yeah, I guess I'll end the screen share now and return to the big screen. I can't see myself, but I hope that you can see me. So as mentioned, this is really early work in progress. And I'm kind of still trying to figure out which materials to include, how to structure the chapter. But as you can see, being here has already tremendously shifted how I'll approach writing this chapter. So once again, thank you for having me. And of course, I'd be happy to hear your comments, thoughts, and questions.
Thank you very much, Johanna. I'm very interested in your approach. I was mentioning at another Fellows Forum a few weeks ago, a work that appeared very early, Orlando Patterson's Sociology of Slavery. He's actually Jamaican and professor of anthropology at Harvard, who's still active. But his whole point in his book was to show the very different ways people could resist slavery without actually formal rebellions, although he discusses those too. And he has a very good chapter, for example, on role-playing. And it always struck me that the literature then got much narrower, and for a period we just focused on violent resistance and slave rebellions, but those are all an extreme. I'm particularly interested in the classics at the moment, and slave rebellions actually were very rare in the Greek world and Roman world, with the great exception of the Spartacus rebellion. And generally, resistance of a more aggressive kind was ruled out simply by numbers and not having, and the difficulty of trying to combine secretly to overthrow a system. And there are very few successful examples other than most famously Haiti. This is, of course, incredibly controversial, the nature of Sally Hemings' relationship. I mean, really, the only thing we have to go on is her son, Madison, and his use of the word concubine. But what you've said, although some people would probably vehemently reject it, who really dislike the use of agency in this context, and indeed in any context where there's a huge power differential. But nevertheless, it seems to me it accords with what Annette Gordon-Reed is essentially arguing, although she's very careful as to how she frames it, and never discusses the possibility, nor feels we have the evidence as to whether it's in any way an affectionate relationship. What she's emphasizing are the benefits to Sally, and how she managed to negotiate it. I was interested too, you're bringing in my Monticello and these various fictional accounts. Again, we were discussing only a couple of weeks ago how fiction sometimes can get at the essence of issues more easily than history, because you're not reliant on having an actual physical source. So how do you see this then? How will you integrate this into your larger body of work? Is this going to give an example of a very different kind of getting away while actually remaining?
You mean the novella?
Yes. Well, you're the ultimate work you're producing and how this is going to integrate.
Yeah, so this chapter follows a chapter in which I also look at minor forms of rebellion, like I think in quoting Saidiya Hartman, I've mentioned stealing away just for a night, for a dance, or for a prayer meeting. And so these kind of minor rebellions are in the previous chapter, and they already diverge from what you've also mentioned, the like major modes of resistance, like slave rebellions, that are usually also only told through the male lens. And this chapter on Sally Hemings then really takes it a step further. And as I try to argue, it's not this movement away from, but like staying within the structures, and within the structures trying to wield some power. Like yeah, I'm not even sure myself if I'm gonna call it agency or what I'm gonna call it, but it's an attempt to find some kind of autonomy.
No, I forgot. Go on.
Yeah, and the novella, it's yeah, I'm as I said, this is still a really early work in progress, and I'm still trying to figure out. But in the novella, it's again a slightly different kind of resistance that unfolds, and it's to be honest, it has a very open end. So it's not that I read the Hemings descendant Denasia and Sally Hemings as like enacting the same kind of resistance, but they are in a dialogue, and yeah, that's where I'm at the moment.
It's interesting because there are quite a number of people, although less well known, who've been writing novels on Sally Hemings. As Annette Gordon-Reed says, she's become possibly the best known Black woman in the United States. And you know, we get letters from people who are proposing to write or have written. And what I do find curious is the sheer number who want, and as I say, these are not necessarily great novels, but who want to portray it as a romantic relationship. I don't know if you have any thoughts as to why that would be. And while you're thinking about my question, I should have said at the beginning, and I always forget, that any member of the audience is welcome to write in a question on our Q&A.
It's interesting. While you were speaking, I had to remember a quote by the same woman, Brenda Yukoski, that I quote in the end, an actual descendant of Sally Hemings. And she says in her family, or for her at least, they would like to think of it as a romantic relationship.
Yes.
Because it makes, for her, as she says it, it makes it easier, or yeah, they would just like it. And I think that's also why so many authors and novelists maybe go in that direction. But in my work, I will try to be very careful to refrain from
Yes.
making kinds of judgments. Because
I just think it's,
we cannot know. It's speculation.
I think it's sort of curious and interesting. It's a sort of cultural phenomenon. I think it's partly often not wanting to deal with the horrors of slavery and to try to think, you know, to find some sort of positive silver lining. Here we have a question from John Ragosta. You've spent some time thinking about the relationship and the parallels and inconsistencies between your subjects and ministry itinerants. Am I missing something there? Yes, that's the bottom. I think the idea of itinerancy is fascinating, given its use with ministers. Churches that require itinerancy among ministers are making a point that their lives are not their own. Have you spent some time thinking about the relationship and parallels and inconsistencies between your subject and ministry itinerants?
Yeah, this is a really interesting question. And I have, in fact, for a while, and I've still not 100% given up on it. I was thinking to include a chapter on Johanna Lee. And so she also kind of, by being a Black woman itinerant, kind of pushes the status quo, and simply by moving around the country sort of is an embodiment of resistance. So yeah, that's all that comes to mind at the moment.
Would anyone else like to ask a question from our audience? We've got a few more minutes if you'd like to add any questions. What's the next step for you? How close are you to finishing the doctorate. And I know things have been somewhat in disarray. You were meant to come here a couple of years ago, and the pandemic is interrupted. I mean, it's been terrible for all researchers, not least because for a long time you couldn't actually get into archives and libraries, and it's disrupted education generally. But how is your timeline now?
Yeah, so I have fortunately about roughly 2 more years. So I'm really still in the beginning of this PhD. And yeah, I've also taken leave of absence because I recently became a mom. So
congratulations.
Thank you.
And is it still the case that you have 2 PhDs in Germany? You have to do another habilitation, or
you do?
Yes. I always pity you. I don't know. One would feel like Sisyphus. I don't think many of us here could tolerate that idea. We've got another question from Deborah Myers. How do you account for Jefferson's enslavement of his own children until the age of 21? Does that speak of fatherly affection or romance? That's a good question as to whether that gives us insight or not into the relationship.
Yeah, so to my knowledge, Jefferson didn't really show fatherly affection to his children with Sally Hemings. I mean, I've shown this quote where there was this mention that they didn't have to do hard work or hard labor, but they were, to my knowledge, at least not treated favorably. And yeah, I don't know if that's what the question is.
It always fascinates me because, of course, he famously had this racialized language in Notes on the State of Virginia. And it was an obsession of his that blacks and whites couldn't commingle. And although he supported the idea of some type of emancipation long term, he talks about African Americans as a separate nation, that rather like Native Americans, except they could integrate if they wanted, but if they weren't willing, they needed to go elsewhere. And he thought in terms of colonization to Africa or the Caribbean. And yet, of course, he had children himself. At least the body of evidence really strongly supports this. He, far from leaving them in slavery, he does emancipate them, and he does give them basic skills and training, and they don't get educated in a formal way. And that's something I found interesting, that they had to go to his children or even grandchildren to try and persuade them to help educate them. But he did give them what he felt was most important, a skill set. And the fact that he freed them when he'd argued against emancipation, an immediate emancipation, on the grounds that it couldn't be a commingling, it would lead to civil warfare. And to be fair to him, at least he didn't have this romanticized Southern idea that enslaved people were happy in the system. He understood it was a vicious system and wrong, but he totally contradicts his own claims by emancipating them. So part of why he wouldn't perhaps do it when they were children is he just didn't think people could survive alone or would be safe. And they were, as you mentioned, and as Madison Hemings mentions, they were very differently treated. I think we may have one more. No. Do you see any others? No. Okay. Well, thank you very much indeed. This is always important to think about. Did you find the Sally Hemings exhibit? What did you think of that as an exhibit? And again, given the difficulty without many material artifacts.
Sorry,
Yes.
I found it very powerful and moving
Yes.
to actually stand in that room. And yeah, I had seen excerpts of it online, but it's definitely just a different feeling of inhabiting that same space. And I talked about it in the presentation also, like inhabiting the same space, even though like it's completely different for me than the quote that I read from Brenda Yokoski. It's still like it still affects you. So I think that's, yeah.
I'm pleased
really well done.
Pleased to hear it. And it's only been up a relatively short time, sort of 5 or so years, but I similarly found it very moving. The fact that there are no windows and it is this confined, almost cell-like place, and to think of that story, it worked well. Well, thank you very much indeed. I look forward to talking more before your return. Is that it next week that you
Unfortunately, I get to spend some more time here in the US.
Oh, good.
Yeah,
Yes.
but I'll
Excellent.
return in October.
Oh, make the best use of your trip. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.